Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our Monday Night Football preview for tonight's matchup between the Texans and the Cowboys. Gonna get you ready for all of your DFS action. First off, we'll look at the Draftkings Showdown slate, how I'm approaching that angle, and then afterwards, I'll look at the prop side of things with our Underdog and Prize Picks exposure. So a lot to talk through here. It's not waste any time at all. It started off with first off, a look at the Showdown side of things and what I'm doing for the single game action. There's only one injury on the offensive side that we really have to worry about heading into lock, and that would be Hunter Lupke down here at just $1,000. And because he is a fullback, not going to have a massive impact on the rest of the slate. So maybe the Cowboys end up going with a few more two tight end sets. If he ends up being rolled out, you could have Dalvin Cook maybe handling some of the short yardage situations. But outside of a touch or two here or there, not much is going to change. So it's more of a traditional slate, definitely one that favors the Texans tonight, as they are sizable favorites on just about every book, and also a relatively low scoring affair with just over a 40-point implied total. So I would expect to see the defenses, kickers, more of those PPR wide receivers, a little bit more common tonight than usual, and definitely emphasis over there towards Houston, whether it's 4-2 stacks, people going out there with that kind of game script, or even just the individual players over there for Houston coming in at slightly higher ownership. So if you're playing at those large field GPPs, you just need to know that heading into building lineups, that if you're going to play people over there from the Texans, it's likely going to come with slightly inflated ownership. So right off the bat, if you're looking to get different compared to the rest of the field, I think a 3-3 build would still have some usage out there, but would maybe be a little bit lower owned than usual, as I don't expect many people to believe in the Cowboys tonight. And if you went with a 4-2 Cowboys build, which even if the Texans win, a 4-2 build could get there if it's real concentrated usage over there on the Texans side. A 4-2 Cowboys build, though, would be extremely different compared to what the rest of the field is doing. So if you're in the large field GPP and you want to get different, there's one or maybe two ways you can do so. Outside of that, it's going to be a lot of Texans-led lineups. Now let's go player by player, give you an idea of how to use each of these kind of players. And towards the top, you got Joe Mixon here at $11,000. If you're playing a Houston-led lineup, you're likely going to want to include him, as when they've gone out there and controlled the script, he's gone over 100 yards almost every single game. So obviously on DraftKings, there's a huge bonus to getting over that 100-yard mark. Add a touchdown on top of that, and even at 16,500 at captain, could end up being your optimal captain play. So I think if you're going to go with the chalk tonight, if you're going to play a Texans-led lineup, that my personal favorite in terms of a spend-up option at least would be a Joe Mixon up top. A Nico Collins could certainly be the reason that the Houston Texans get ahead. He's also been an absolute monster when he's been healthy this year, but still trying to get back from the injury that had him sidelined for a few weeks. So I'm not sure if he's 100% at this point, and because it is such a wide spread between these two teams, you'd have to imagine that the Texans are going to be running it quite a bit. In fact, his rushing attempts prop is at like 21 and a half out there on a few books. So clearly even the sports books think he's going to get a ton of usage out there tonight. So whether it's raw projection, they're at over a 20-point projection. Whether it's points per dollar here, just under a 2x projection, he's pretty much the top play across the board. And that's going to come with ownership as the most expensive play on the chalky team. They're at about 65% total ownership. But if you're getting over the field, you're trying to correlate a Texans-led lineup, I don't know how you don't play a Joe Mixon tonight. So he's a piece of chalk that if you're going with that side of things, you're probably just going to have to eat there at $11,000. CeeDee Lamb is $10,800, which normally we wouldn't bat an eye at, especially with Dak Prescott at quarterback. But with Cooper Rush leading things out there for Dallas, he takes a significant hit when it comes to his projection. In fact, his projection's there at just about 15 points, where usually he's in that 19 to 20 point range. So that is affecting his efficiency, as he still carries that inflated price tag, but does have a significantly lower ownership number as well. So he's maybe not the best play if you're playing out there in cash. If you're playing in one of your higher dollar single entries, there's going to be a lot of risk in getting to a CeeDee Lamb, but he is still a very good yard after catch wide receiver, still going to be a threat over there in the red zone. And just because he's maybe not the best play from a median standpoint, doesn't mean that you can't use him in large field GPPs. So if you're going with the Texans led lineup, I'll just say right now that a lot of my builds, even in the large field GPPs, are probably going to favor that Houston side, just as I see them winning out there this evening. CeeDee Lamb Lamb, though, if you want to use a buyback out there for the Cowboys, he'd be mighty fine expensive at $10,800, but you could use him for a little bit of leverage, as he's only about 27.5% at the flex position. So he's expensive. A lot of that is he's overpriced, right? That's why the ownership's going to be a little bit lower, but I think it opens up a little bit of upside when it comes to that leverage. Nico Collins is $10,400, so we have the injury concerns with him returning from that lengthy stay, but he's $10,400, and when he's on the field, he's the clear alpha wide receiver for the Texans. He averages well over 75 yards a game when he's completely healthy for Houston, and what I like here, just like CeeDee Lamb, is he's got that yard after catch ability and that red zone upside as well. He's a big-bodied wide receiver, even more so than what you have there with CeeDee Lamb, and he's coming at higher ownership. So I've got him at about 55%. He's also a more efficient play. You can see at about a 17.6 point projection. In terms of his price efficiency, he's 1.7x as opposed to the 1.4x like we have there with CeeDee Lamb. So there are a few things that favor Nico Collins, but if you're looking to get different, just like Joe Mixon at the top, you're not going to get that much different to the field with a 55% owned player. So Joe Mixon, in my opinion, even though he does cost you $600 more, even though he's 10% higher owned, I think it's more substantiated because the game script, the spread, all of that is going to favor the running game out there for Houston, as opposed to a potentially banged up Nico Collins. So I still think he's in play out there in lineups, but if I had to choose between one of these two as a spend up, you guys know why I like a Joe Mixon now. CJ Stroud down here at $9,800. His projection is really solid, I think mostly because of the price tag. He's there at about 1.9x points per dollar value, 18.5 raw points in terms of his projection right now. And if you're going to play the Texans-led lineup, I don't think it's the worst idea to go out there and play CJ Stroud. But if you're going to use a Joe Mixon, potentially even at the captain spot, and you want to use a CeeDee Lamb or potentially like a Dowdle, one of those other top-tier players over there in Dallas, it is hard to pull off if you're going Joe Mixon and a CJ Stroud. So personally, I'm probably going to have a little bit less CJ Stroud than the rest of the field. It's not like I'm completely avoiding him by any means, but because I think the Houston Texans are going to be playing from ahead for most of this game, I can't see CJ Stroud having to throw an absolute ton out there tonight. In fact, I could see him having one of his lower passing outputs of the entire year. Not so much that the matchup's an issue. Cowboys defense has been shredded over here in 2024. Mostly due to injuries. It's not really their fault out there from what they've suffered from. But at this point, $9,800 CJ Stroud, they could almost be too far ahead for him to really capitalize on this kind of price tag. So kind of like Nico Collins, these are players that I'm going to have in my player pool, but there's a good chance that I'm pretty much at most matching the field out there on my exposure, if not going slightly under the field on these two. And it's not like they're terrible plays, as we've already talked about. It's just that I like Joe Mixon a little bit more. Tank Dell has Nico Collins coming back, so it's not like he's suffering that much in terms of projection. He's still there at about 13 points. The issue is that he's far too expensive. This kind of price tag is where he should be without a Nico Collins, so that puts him at about 1.4x when it comes to his price efficiency, which is lower than really what we're hoping for. It's right around where CeeDee Lamb is, which is, a similar impact. He's got the worst quarterback play, which of course is holding him back. Tank Dell is just going to see a little bit less usage this week. So if you're looking for leverage, it's not like guys like Tank Dell or CeeDee Lamb can't get there. It's just that they're going to have a lower percentage chance of getting there. And as such, the field isn't going to play them nearly as much. So if you're going to play a Houston wide receiver, I think I might prefer a Tank Dell over a Nico Collins because of that ownership aspect. And also the price tag is a whole $1,000 cheaper. So if you're going to go with a Joe Mixon as maybe your spend up option, maybe even your captain there at $16,500, that $1,000 that you're saving with the Tank Dell and that lower ownership to maybe get you a little bit different inside of that chalkier side there in the Texans could come in handy from both aspects, both from the salary and the ownership component. So $9,400, he's not my favorite play. Same thing with CeeDee Lamb. I think that there's a reason why they're projecting for lower ownership, but in certain contests, especially the big large field GPPs for tonight, I think that those players have a lot more utility than they do out there in like a single entry or a smaller field GPP where you're not as worried about getting different to the rest of the field. Rico Dowdle, if you can stomach taking some 4-2 Dallas lineups, Rico Dowdle should almost certainly be in those builds. But even if you're taking a buyback out there for Dallas, Rico Dowdle's live because he is a very stout contributor out of the backfield as a wide receiver. He doesn't run a ton of routes, but he does get a lot of targets when they're playing from behind. And of course, with that even larger than 7-point spread out there in some books, he could be in play for some of that usage as well. So if you're playing the Cowboys stacks, you're assuming that they're going to be playing from ahead. That would, of course, give them extra rushing usage. But if they're also playing from way behind, I think that could help them out from that PPR aspect as well. As, of course, Draftkings is a PPR website, a full PPR, in fact, which is huge for a receiving running back like a Rico Dowdle. His projection is average there at about 1.6 points per dollar, but the ownership is also relatively in check. Maybe not as low as somebody like a Tank Dell. He's a little bit overpriced, but not in that 50 to 60% range like we had for some of the other top tier spend ups. Cooper Rush is here at $8,000, so his projection is very modest at about 12.5 points, but that's average when it comes to your price efficiency at about 1.6x points per dollar. So just like a Rico Dowdle, he's not going to pop off the page in terms of projection, but if you're looking for a buyback, and it could be a Cooper Rush plus even a Dowdle that you use as a buyback, but a Cooper Rush CeeDee Lamb buyback is probably my favorite out there for 4-2 Texans lineups. If I can afford to take CeeDee Lamb and a Cooper Rush as my buyback, I love that kind of upside there because the ownership once again isn't all that crazy. So even if you're going with some chalky Texans players, especially Joe Mixon, I mean 65% is about the highest ownership that you're going to find. If you can use some of these lower owned Dallas players as buybacks, and there are even lower owned options that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this video, maybe that's how you get different within that chalkier game script that other people are going with. So I like Cooper Rush at $8,000. He's cheap enough to go out there and use as a buyback. And if he was like $9,000, $9,500, he'd probably be a fade for me out there tonight. But at this kind of price tag, this mid-tier range, there's a lot of utility in getting to a quarterback like that, especially if they're playing from behind and have to throw the ball as much as they may have to. It's worth noting, though, that Dallas may have to go to Trey Lance, so you're not going to see Trey Lance on my projections, but I like to point this out, at least for like the large field GPPs, as we've seen some crazy shit happen with these backup quarterback situations. A lot of times it's injuries, right? Somebody goes down early in the game, the backup comes in and then has a really good game. If you're playing in the large field GPP, I'm not going to have any Trey Lance tonight, but there have been some rumors that they might go to him if Cooper Rush continues to struggle, and he's going to be completely unowned out there in GPP. So if you want to get really wild about your build, maybe you consider going to him, but I don't know if I have as much stones to get to that kind of play. Let's go down to this 5K range. So we've got Jake Ferguson here at $5,800. So he's really cheap compared to where he usually comes in, partially because he struggled the last few weeks with Dak Prescott out, but he's got a 9.1 point projection, 1.6 points per dollar value. And compared to these defenses and kickers, he's actually got a worse projection, especially than these kickers like an Aubrey and Fairbairn. But I think the ownership might start to really congregate around these kickers. So right now, you can see that the ownership's pretty flat. In fact, Ferguson's actually a little bit higher owned than where I have these kickers. But one thing I'll be tracking throughout the rest of the day is the ownership, especially on these two guys here. If they end up getting closer to like 35, 36% apiece, which is something that I anticipate happening probably throughout this afternoon. Of course, guys, you guys can download these sheets over there on my Patreon page for all the projections as they change throughout the day. I've got my entire player pool on there, the stack info, script info that I'm going with on there too. We'll have to see, though. This is just my intuition a little bit earlier here on Monday, I should say, that these two might steam up a little bit the closer that we get to lock. So, and if that ends up happening, that is going to come at the detriment of a Jake Ferguson. All the extra ownership that these two are probably soaking up is going to come from a Ferguson, maybe a little bit from Dalton Schultz down here at $5,000. But especially from Ferguson because he's a little bit more expensive. So I don't think the kickers are terrible plays, especially with Brandon Aubrey, with how inefficient that Cowboys offense is likely to be. But a guy like Ferguson, especially if the ownership starts to shift a little bit, is going to be maybe my favorite play down there in the 5K range. A little bit cheaper, we got guys like a Dalton Schultz, a Jalen Tolbert here. We're going to talk about these two a lot later when we go through the prop section, but Jalen Tolbert in particular might be my favorite play down here in the 4K range, partially because he's a really good PPR wide receiver, has been getting a ton of targets here in 2024, and in fact, his last 8 games, he's had at least 3 receptions in every game, which, hint, hint, will come in handy when we get to the prop section. But yeah, 30% ownership, if he stays at a very reasonable number like that, I'm going to be all over him over here for tonight's slate. John Mechie III is probably not as playable as he has been the last few weeks, just because they're likely to have Nico Collins back tonight. You got Xavier Hutchinson as well, probably not as much in play because of the same reason. Dario Abungawale, if they could end up playing from way behind, he is the receiving back over there for Houston, so if you're playing like a 4-2 Cowboys lineup, I guess he would come into play in those kind of builds. Robert Woods, he's going to be blocking quite a bit for the Texans, but probably doesn't have enough usage with Nico Collins back. You got Ezekiel Elliott here at $2,600. He'll see snaps, he'll see usage out there for the Cowboys, but he's probably not going to see enough snaps to get there in large field GPPs. If he was going to be an optimal play, it'd probably come down to a Rico Dowdle injury or him going out there and vulturing a touchdown in the red zone, which is certainly possible within his range of outcomes, but not my favorite play on tonight's slate. You got Jalen Brooks, fourth string wide receiver, fourth stringer out there for the Cowboys. He's got about a 4-point projection, so he doesn't have the highest ceiling of any of these wide receivers, but just like a Zeke, if he gets into the end zone, maybe he pays off that way. A Cade Stover likely needs to score to get there too, but he will be playing quite a bit for the Texans as they use two tight end sets, and Cade Stover is a really good blocker, so he tends to play a lot of snaps in that capacity, which, by the way, in terms of red zone upside, a lot of people are looking to those like receiving tight ends in the red zone. I think a sneakier play might be those blocking tight ends, as you know, you'll bring out a 2 tight end set, you'll bring in some of that meat, and if you end up using play action, oftentimes the tight end that is left wide open that ends up scoring those like 1-2 yard touchdowns is the blocking tight end like Cade Stover. And it's been quite a minute since we've had one of those touchdowns out there for Showdown, and Stover feels like the perfect kind of player to do that. So kind of like a Jalen Brooks, even an Ezekiel Elliott up here at $2,600. These are the kind of guys that I'm mixing into a few lineups. You got Dalvin Cook. He has not seen that many snaps, that many touches out there for the Cowboys. So not my favorite play, but at least 1.4 point projection. He's at least in the projections. You got Kamonte Turpin down here at $1,200. He's more of a special teams guy out there for the Cowboys, but you have seen him used in some gadget plays the last few weeks. So he's got a better projection than a lot of the other guys around him, but he's definitely got to get there with a big play to pay off that kind of price tag. A Schoonmaker, you know, he's your third string tight end, second string tight end out there for the Cowboys. You're not counting on him all that much. And same thing with Brevin Spann-Ford. He's in that same role. He's either number 2, number 3 tight end out there for the Cowboys. I think it fluctuates week to week out there with how they're deploying these two. These would be like your pure GBP flyers. Like, you're not playing these in any contest but the big GBP tonight. The big contest with like 50, 100,000 entries. These kind of players like a Schoonmaker or Ford maybe get there once a year. And it's going to require a touchdown, maybe a big 40, 50 yard catch where they, you know, catch something and get a bunch of yards after the catch. That's really the only way that you see those guys getting there. A Flourney, I've heard good things about him. I've heard that he's really good after the catch, but he's playing behind so many other wide receivers for the Cowboys that it's hard to really think that he has a good chance to get there. So in terms of pure spend down options, I would say that guys like Schoonmaker, Ford, you know, they're like 5%ers for me out there in large field GPPs. A Turpin's maybe like a 10%er. You know, you hope that he goes out there, maybe scores a touchdown with a punt return or gets there with a big play. The guys that I'm a little bit more excited about, a Stover or Brooks are like 20%ers, maybe even an Ezekiel Elliott, just kind of hope for an injury, I guess, out there with Dowdle. Obviously, you don't want anyone to get hurt, but you play him in case that kind of things happen. Where I'm a lot more comfortable, though, these are like, you know, 20, maybe 10%ers that we talked about down there, are your Tolberts, where I could play him in like 40, 50% of my lineups. A Dalton Schultz, obviously more expensive, $4,600, $5,000 respectively, but a much higher floor which helps out a lot when you're playing single entries, some of your smaller field GPPs or cash, but also a much higher ceiling than some of those other bottom tier players. Like unlike a Stover, unlike some of these other guys that they're probably going to have one play that gets them there, that scores them like 8 to 10 fantasy points. I mean, a guy like Tolbert, a guy like Dalton Schultz could be contributing for most of the game. And rather than just getting you that 7 to maybe 10 point performance, they've got that 15 to 20 point potential. So I think if you have the salary, try and spend up for some of these players. And because I'm not as confident with some of these bottom tier guys, it does mean that I'm going to be a little bit more balanced with my salary towards the top. So I know I mentioned before, like if you use a Joe Mixon, it's kind of tough to fit in a Collins or a CJ Stroud, mostly because I don't have a guy down there at like $200 that I feel really good about fitting into lineups. So hopefully it gives you guys an idea of how I'm attacking this slate. Definitely going to have more Texans exposure than what I'm going to have on the other side with the Cowboys, and going to have to find ways to get different because that is the chalkier side of the game. And now for the prop side of things, where we're going to go through a few spots that I've already entered. You might want to consider adding to a few slips yourself. So the first prop we're going to go through is going to be this over on Dalton Schultz reception. So he's at 2.5 over here on Prize Picks, even money, which is great because he does have a multiplier over there in Underdog. More on that here in just a few minutes. But Dalton Schultz, the reason for liking this, he's covered this in 6 of his last 7 games. He's covered it in 7 of his 10 games this year. So he has a really solid hit rate for the over here. And he's also juiced in the minus 125 to minus 135 range over there in some books. So he's got close to what we'd call true plus EV value. You add on top of that the elite hit rate this year, and the fact that Nico Collins is back. A lot of people may say that would downgrade his target share, but that's not necessarily true. He's not a wide receiver that is getting directly competed with for targets. He's going to play about the same amount of snaps as you've seen before. In fact, I would say that that's likely not going to change whatsoever compared to what you've had. He may have a slightly lower usage rate, but that's also why he's here at 2.5 receptions. He's at a 3.5 reception line for a few games over the last few weeks. Now down here at 2.5 and juice towards the over on quite a few books. So this might continue to juice towards the over as the day goes on, as he does have that elite hit rate on this over for the year, which is why I'm mixing it in over there at 2.5 receptions. Next up, we have an over on Jalen Tolbert receptions, which for some reason was just ripped off the board. I'm not quite sure, as it doesn't have elite plus EV value or anything like that. In fact, this Dalton Schultz prop had more juiced for the over on books than what we had with Jalen Tolbert. So we'll go over here to Underdog. It's available over here as of right now. Unfortunately, though, with a multiplier on both spots. So the reason why I want to point this out over here in Prize Picks is that I think there's a good chance that they end up reposting that Jalen Tolbert at 2.5 receptions. If they do, take it over here on Prize Picks, as you'll get a full 3x payout for it. If you took it on Underdog, which as of this very second is the only place where it's available, you get a 2.65x payout. So that is quite a difference, obviously, in terms of your long-term payout. But the reason for liking this Jalen Tolbert over is he's gone over this 2.5 line in 8 straight games. He's gone over in every game but one this year, which coincidentally was the first game of the season. And even with Cooper Rush playing, has gotten a lot of targets the last few weeks, and he's in that same kind of juice range. I think it was minus 125 to minus 130 for the over. A few books did have Schultz at minus 135, so slightly less juice than what we had with that first prop, which is why I'm a little bit surprised that they ended up taking that off of the board. So Dalton Schultz over, that one is still available. You guys can get to it. If you wanted to find something to, I guess, replace it with as of right now, I wouldn't be completely against taking this over on yardage, but what you'll see the last few weeks, it's not the only reasoning against this, is that even when he had like 3 receptions, he went under the receiving yardage the last few weeks. So he tends to be a downfield wide receiver. I think the last few weeks where he had that low receiving yard total was probably a little bit of an outlier, but that's also available, I believe, at 24.5 over here on this site. So you know, it's kind of annoying, the fact that they took that 2.5 receptions off of Prize Picks. So obviously, having a Patreon membership, having access to that has its benefits, like being able to catch those props before they get ripped off the board. So make sure to check out the Patreon page for all the different pieces of exposure I'm getting to, and of course the analysis as soon as it's dropping, so you can catch all those lines before they end up becoming stale. On top of that, I do want to point out a few other props that I thought were at least interesting out there for tonight. So The CJ Stroud under on touchdowns is juiced towards the under. So this was even money before we went on live stream here. What I want to see is what they've done on Prize Picks. So yeah, they ended up ripping that off of the board. So if they end up posting that back at 1.5 and then even money is where it was before over here in Prize Picks, I wouldn't be against taking that under, just because if the it's only a 40-point total, so it's a relatively low-scoring game that they're expecting. If the Texans are playing from way ahead, they're going to be doing a whole lot of running and not a lot of passing there in the second half. And what you've seen from the Texans in 2024 is that they've been a lot more rush-heavy in the red zone than what you've seen with the pass. So that's another reason why I want to take this under on passing touchdowns, as for the year, I think he's averaging like 1.35 passing touchdowns per game, which is respectable, but it's still below this 1.5 number that you have there. A few other ones I was looking at, I was considering this over on CeeDee Lamb receiving yards. 57.5 for CeeDee Lamb looks extremely low, but we do have to account for the fact that Cooper Rush is playing quarterback, and that is hard to quantify as we don't have a massive sample size to work with. But in the first game that Cooper Rush came back, he was targeting CeeDee Lamb an absolute shit ton. In fact, I believe they scored a touchdown before CeeDee Lamb ended up getting hurt on like the final play of the game. So they've had some success together. It's just the last few weeks you haven't been able to see it quite yet. So like, these two I haven't entered for slip quite yet myself. Of course, on the Patreon page, I'll be adding any exposure that I end up getting to myself. But the CeeDee Lamb over is something I was looking at a little bit. Plus EV value isn't really there. I think it's at that same number, maybe even 56.5 on a lot of books. So let's see what they have here in Prize Picks. Yeah, he's at 58.5. So yeah, I guess if you're going to play it, the best place to do it is over here in underdog like we had. But I don't love this multiplier on Stroud. So let's go through the board just a little bit more. I do know that Nico Collins was juiced towards the under for his receptions prop. So it's not so much that you're betting against Nico Collins. This is much more game script based. If the Texans are going to be playing from way ahead, probably not having to pass nearly as much, you might add on top of that the fact that Collins is still a little bit banged up from the injury that he had there. So I don't think that one's the worst under. So we're not going to add this as like an official slip over here for the video, but like those would be a few leans I'd be looking at. Let me see. Is he at 5.5 over here on Prize Picks too? He is, so he's at that same kind of number. He's not going to have a great track record with that, as you'd expect, but he was much healthier when you had these kind of stats being posted. So yeah, not an official slip that we're going to go with. Check out the Patreon page for all of that, but maybe a few extra leans I was considering in my back pocket. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the Monday Night Football preview. Before you hopping out of here, go ahead and smash that like button for me, and also comment down below who you've got as your top scorer here on the Monday Night Football slate for a free chance to earn a month on my Patreon page. If you get the top score, and that'll be in terms of their Draftkings points for tonight, you will win that free month on my Patreon page as long as you give me their projection within 2 fantasy points. So go ahead, claim your player down below, and give me your best guess for what their score is going to be. If you get that and you have that guess within 2, if you end up being the closest guess of anyone in the community, you will automatically win that free month access, and that'll be an all access tier. It'll give you all the golf and football stuff that I'm doing at any point, including the main slate, the showdown stuff like you see here in these videos, and everything over there on the golf side. So make sure to enter the giveaway if you guys haven't already. Like that button, subscribe to the channel if you guys haven't already as well, so you don't miss any of the content to come throughout the rest of the year. And let's have ourselves a Monday Night Football slate.